The Unseen Armada, January 17, 1944, Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands. The sun had not yet broken the horizon when Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Nakamura pressed his field glasses against the salt-crusted observation post. What he saw made his hands tremble, not from fear, but from the impossibility of what stretched before him across the dark Pacific waters. Ships. Hundreds of ships, more ships than he had seen in his entire naval career, more ships than he believed America could possibly possess. They materialized from the morning mist like steel mountains, their hulls pregnant with machinery, men and materials. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the low thrumming of diesel engines, a mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the gentle lapping of waves against coral. Nakamura's pencil scratched frantically across his observation log, numbers and estimates that he knew his superiors would dismiss as exaggeration, as panic, as the delusions of a man who had stared too long at the sea. He was recording the future. He was witnessing the death of an empire. The amphibious assault capability of the United States Navy had been, until that moment, a theoretical concern for Imperial Japanese military planners. They had studied the landings at Guadalcanal, analyzed the reports from Tarawa, noted the increasing sophistication of American operations. But nothing in their doctrine, nothing in their experience of warfare had prepared them for the industrial symphony now unfolding before Nakamura's disbelieving eyes. The Japanese military had built its Pacific strategy on the assumption that island garrisons could hold long enough for the combined fleet to arrive and destroy invasion forces. This assumption rested on another, that amphibious operations were inherently slow, vulnerable, and limited in scale. The Americans, Nakamura realized as dawn light revealed the true magnitude of the Armada, had rendered this assumption obsolete. The doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been forged in the Russo-Japanese War, refined through decades of naval tradition that emphasized decisive fleet engagements and warrior spirit. Amphibious operations were considered auxiliary actions, logistically constrained affairs requiring specialized circumstances. The Japanese themselves had conducted successful amphibious invasions across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in 1941 and 1942, but these had relied on surprise, air superiority, and the seizure of existing port facilities. The idea of creating a port where none existed, of landing not hundreds, but tens of thousands of men with their vehicles, artillery, and supplies directly onto hostile beaches, seemed to defy the fundamental limitations of naval warfare. Yet this was precisely what the Americans had systematized, industrialized, and perfected. The Japanese reports that filtered back to Tokyo from outposts across the Pacific told a story that military leadership found difficult, even painful, to accept. Major Takeo Sugiyama, a logistics officer who survived the Battle of Saipan, wrote in his classified post-action report, "The enemy does not invade. The enemy transplants. They bring not an army, but a civilization, fully formed across thousands of miles of ocean." His words were initially dismissed as defeatist rhetoric. But as similar observations accumulated from Kwajalein, from Eniwetok, from Saipan, and Guam, and Peleliu, the pattern became undeniable. The Americans had solved the ancient problem of amphibious warfare through a solution so audacious it bordered on the absurd. They had industrialized the ocean itself. The heart of this transformation was a vessel that traditional naval officers barely considered a warship at all, the landing ship tank, the LST. These flat-bottomed, ungainly craft could beach themselves directly on shore, drop their bow ramps and disgorge tanks, trucks and artillery pieces onto sand and coral. They were slow, awkward and vulnerable. They were also revolutionary. Japanese naval doctrine had no equivalent, no answer to a ship that was half freighter, half amphibious beachhead. But the LST was merely the most visible element of a vast logistical ecosystem. Behind the tank landing ships came the Liberty ships, the Victory ships, the attack transports, the attack cargo ships, each specialized for a particular function in the machinery of invasion. The Americans had created an entire taxonomy of vessels designed not for traditional naval combat, but for the projection of industrial power across oceanic distances. Lieutenant Nakamura's report, filed on January 18th, included an inventory that reads like a catalogue of impossibility. He counted over 300 vessels of various types supporting the Kwajalein operation alone. He observed specialized craft for unloading ammunition, for distilling fresh water, for repairing damaged equipment, for providing medical care. He noted the presence of floating dry docks, mobile workshops, refrigerated storage vessels. He watched as engineers constructed a functioning airfield on conquered territory within 72 hours of the first landing. His conclusion, buried in the technical language of military reporting, carried the weight of prophecy. The enemy has achieved integration of sea and land power that cannot be opposed by traditional naval defense. They do not conquer territory. They relocate their industrial capacity to that territory. What Japanese commanders had expected was an American force constrained by the same logistical limitations that governed their own operations. They anticipated that invasion forces would suffer from supply shortages, that the tyranny of distance would create vulnerability, that extended operations far from established bases would inevitably degrade American combat effectiveness. These expectations were rooted in Japan's own experience. The Imperial Japanese forces had extended themselves across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, and by 1943 the strain was showing. Garrison forces on isolated atolls went months without resupply. Soldiers and sailors alike faced shortages of food, medicine, ammunition. The vastness of the Pacific was supposed to be Japan's ally, imposing unsustainable logistical burdens on any enemy attempting to advance across it. The Americans, instead, had made the Pacific their highway. They had transformed logistical challenge into logistical demonstration. Captain Hideo Yamazaki, interrogated after the fall of Guam, described the experience with the precision of trauma. On the third day of the American occupation, I observed their soldiers eating fresh ice cream on an island that had been a battlefield 72 hours before. We had not seen fresh meat in 8 months. Our medical supplies were exhausted, our ammunition was rationed, and they had ice cream. The ice cream was not frivolity. It was symbol and substance, the manifestation of a logistical capability so overwhelming it could afford to transport luxury across the world's largest ocean to men who were, by any traditional military standard, on the edge of supply lines that should not exist. The documents captured after the fall of Saipan included detailed Japanese intelligence assessments of American amphibious operations. These reports, filed by officers who had witnessed the invasions firsthand or who had compiled testimony from survivors, reveal a gradual, reluctant recognition of systemic American advantages. One report, dated June 1944, notes, American landing forces arrive with sufficient supplies for 30 days of sustained operations. They establish supply depots on beaches while combat is still ongoing. Within 1 week, they have created port facilities superior to those we constructed over years of occupation. Within 2 weeks, they are exporting supplies to other invasion points. The document includes carefully hand-drawn diagrams of American beach organization, showing the methodical zones for different types of cargo, the systematic approach to turning chaos into order. But beyond the ships and the supplies, beyond the technical marvel of logistics made manifest, the Japanese reports revealed something that military planners found even more disturbing. The Americans had democratized warfare itself. Japanese forces were trained to accept hardship as a virtue, to see suffering as proof of dedication to the emperor and the nation. Privation was expected, even honored. The American military operated under a completely different philosophy. They fed their soldiers 3 meals a day of varied, nutritious food. They rotated men out of frontline positions for rest. They provided comprehensive medical care, not just for battle wounds, but for disease, for dental problems, for mental health. They supplied their forces so abundantly that even rear echelon personnel had access to materials that Japanese frontline troops could only imagine. This abundance was not weakness. It was warfare by different rules, with different assumptions about the value of human life and the relationship between citizen and state. Lieutenant Jiro Kawasaki, a junior officer who survived the Battle of Peleliu, wrote in his personal journal, later seized by American forces, "I have concluded that we are not fighting an enemy army. We are fighting an enemy economy. They waste more in a day than we produce in a month, but it is not waste. It is philosophy. They believe their soldiers deserve these things. This belief, more than their weapons, may be what defeats us." His insight cut to the heart of the matter. American logistical superiority was not merely a matter of industrial capacity, though capacity was certainly part of it. It was a reflection of a democratic society's commitment to its citizens, translated into the language of military operations. The symbolic power of American supply became a recurring theme in Japanese accounts. The ubiquitous sea ration, derided by American soldiers as monotonous and uninspiring, appeared in Japanese reports as evidence of impossible plenty. Each sea ration contained not just food, but cigarettes, toilet paper, can openers, matches, an entire ecosystem of provision in a single container. Japanese soldiers surviving on rice and dried fish, when they had food at all, encountered Americans who complained about the quality of their 3 daily meals. The psychological impact was profound. It undermined the narrative that hardship built character, and that Japanese spiritual superiority would overcome American material advantage. How could spirit triumph when the enemy seemed to have made hardship itself obsolete? The transformation in Japanese military thinking was neither immediate nor universal. Pride, doctrine, and ideology all resisted the implications of what their own reports documented. But by late 1944, even the most optimistic assessments acknowledged American logistical dominance. A classified Naval General Staff memo from October 1944 stated, "The enemy's ability to sustain large-scale operations indefinitely across the Pacific theater represents a fundamental shift in the character of naval warfare. Traditional calculations of supply line vulnerability do not apply. They have, in effect, created mobile supply lines that move with their forces." The memo recommended a shift in defensive strategy, away from attempts to outlast American sieges toward inflicting maximum casualties in hopes of breaking American will. It was an admission that the logistical contest was already lost. The captured documents from Imperial General Headquarters reveal extensive analysis of specific American vessels and technologies. The LST received particular attention. Japanese naval engineers studied photographs and wreckage, trying to understand the design principles. They noted the ballast system that allowed the ships to deliberately ground themselves and then refloat. They observed the bow door design, the internal ramp systems, the integration of vehicle storage with rapid deployment capability. They calculated that each LST could deliver the cargo equivalent of several conventional cargo vessels directly to a beach, bypassing the need for port facilities entirely. One engineering assessment concluded, to match this capability would require complete redesign of our amphibious doctrine and construction of several hundred specialized vessels. Given current industrial capacity and resource constraints, this is not achievable. The report did not say that Japan had lost. It did not need to. By 1945, as American forces moved closer to the Japanese home islands, the reports took on a different character. There was less analysis, more resignation. A document from Okinawa, dated April 1945, described the American invasion fleet in almost apocalyptic terms. The ocean itself has become their weapon. They arrive not in ships, but in a floating nation, complete and self-sufficient. Our fortifications, our courage, our willingness to die, none of this matters against an enemy who brings their entire country with them across the sea. The officer who wrote these words died in the defense of Okinawa. His report survived, filed in archives that would be seized by American occupation forces 4 months later. The epilogue to this revelation came not in battle, but in silence. When American forces occupied Japan in August 1945, they brought with them the same logistical apparatus that had conquered the Pacific. Japanese civilians observed the same phenomenon that had stunned their military. The Americans arrived with abundance. They unloaded supplies not just for their own forces, but for the defeated population. They brought food to prevent starvation, medicine to combat disease, materials to begin reconstruction. The generosity was strategic, calculated, part of a broader policy objective. But it was also real. The same system that had projected military power across an ocean now projected relief and recovery. The same LSTs that had landed tanks on hostile beaches now delivered grain to Japanese ports. The lesson the Japanese military learned, documented in thousands of pages of reports, assessments, and observations, was fundamentally about more than logistics. It was about the nature of American power itself. The United States had not defeated Japan primarily through superior tactics or better soldiers or more ruthless leadership. It had defeated Japan by creating a military system that reflected American industrial capacity, organizational genius, and democratic values. The amphibious operations that conquered the Pacific were not just military victories. They were demonstrations of a different way of organizing human effort, of valuing human life, of connecting means and ends. In the end, Lieutenant Commander Nakamura's trembling hands that morning in January 1944 had been registering not just the shock of numbers, but the recognition of obsolescence. The empire he served had built its strategy on assumptions that no longer held. The ocean was not a barrier, distance was not protection. Industrial power, properly organized and applied, could move mountains, or more precisely, could move the mountains to wherever they were needed. The American armada that stretched across the horizon was not just a fleet, it was a prophecy, a revelation written in steel and diesel fuel, telling a story whose ending was already determined. The unseen element in American victory was never unseen at all. It was documented, analyzed, reported, and ultimately understood by the very forces it defeated. They had seen the future arriving across the water, ship by ship, supply by supply, until the future became the present, and the present became history.